Organized by Marete, who just stepped out of the Caribbean Cultural Center. She stepped back in. Here's Martin. Martin, did you want to speak some initial framing?
For those of you who have been part of the ongoing conversation, it's been an exploration, right, and a dialogue amongst community-based organizations, institutions of higher ed, elected officials, people in different cultural arts positions, looking at the state of community arts, one, looking at what the partnerships between higher education and community-based organizations might be. And in this climate, in this economic climate, what are the kinds of frameworks that will assure the field, the community arts field, as well as those partnerships that are mutually beneficial for higher ed and community arts. So with that, I leave you with Randy, who has been the co-host of these dialogues.
Great. Wonderful array of presentations, and realize that we both need to be able to engage the terms of assessment by which the community-based arts and the values that we treasure are made invisible or disappeared. The very means of measuring them and supposedly valuing them, they are devalued. And that we have to also change the narrative, right? That we have to think about some of the overarching narratives for who we are and what we are together in this country and in the world. So we're hoping, by bringing together another incredible panel of strong, critical, vibrant voices, that we can get a little bit of a national picture of what's going on with arts policy, but also people who have been working very hard, very diligently, and very creatively on shifting these terms of assessment and narrative. So we have with us today Marete Wester, who's the Director of Arts Policy at Americans for the Arts. Mitch Menchaca, who's Vice Chair of the Association of American Cultures and Director of Local Arts Advancement at Americans for the Arts. Sonia Manjon is going to be joining us momentarily. She's the Vice President for Institutional Partnerships and Chief Diversity Officer at Wesleyan University. And Paul Nagle, who's Executive Director of the Cultural Strategies Initiative. Each speaker is just going to speak for 5-10 minutes and give us some things to think about, and then we'll open up the conversation. And I will disappear, but Nagle will be
I will try to facilitate.
stepping in. Yes,
I signed it. Thank you.
Baton in hand. Cool. So, do you guys want to order yourselves, or would you like to order you?
Whatever
Go ahead.
you prefer.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm like,
She's wearing purple.
purple, that's right. Who knew that was likely the power color? Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you all today. As Randy said, I'm Marete Wester. I'm with Americans for the Arts, and I think my role on the panel here today is to kind of talk a little bit about what the national picture is for both funding the arts at the public and private sector level, and also how we at Americans for the Arts have been working with elected officials and the private sector to help make the case and build the value proposition for the arts. Just kind of a quick word about Americans for the Arts, because it is a rather, sometimes if you go onto our website, you will think it is a very complicated organization with a lot of moving parts. And actually, Mitch is in charge of, and I'm kind of happy to be co-presenting on the panel because Mitch will poke me in the ribs and kick me into the table if I actually misrepresent what we're doing with our local groups. But Americans for the Arts is a national organization. We are the professional membership association for local arts agencies nationally. These local groups are in either divisions of city government, county government, or not-for-profit organizations. And for the most part, they are the boots on the ground that are doing cultural development and helping to foster the environment for artists and arts organizations in their areas and in their regions. We are actually a national organization that is a merge of several national organizations. The first was with our core group of constituents, the National Assembly of Local Arts Agencies, and with American Council of the Arts here in New York, which brought together for the first time the local grassroots community organizers and developers for the arts with patrons, philanthropists, and researchers who were working on national policy issues. That was about 10 years ago we did that. Over the next several years, we brought into our network what we call the State Arts Action Network, which is a coalition of state advocacy groups that are working on state issues and of advocacy and development. We also merged with the Arts and Business Council several years ago, which brought into our network a concentration of service providers who are focused on trying to engage business in conversations about how to support the arts community. And finally, we completed a merge with the Business Committee on the Arts, which was an entity that was founded about 30 years ago by Nelson Rockefeller. And that consists of an executive board of corporate CEOs who again feel the arts are important enough to be promoted at the corporate level. Our president and CEO, our boss, Bob Lynch, said that is the last merge he is going to ever do. We'll see. But what that has actually allowed Americans for the Arts to do is to be essentially a national entity that's networked and engaged with both practitioners at the local level who are supporting local arts development, as well as people who are working at various levels of leadership, whether it is in public sector, elected leadership, or private sector leadership, foundations, corporations, individual donors, to try to help make the case for why the arts are important. And how we do this essentially breaks into three areas. Cultivating leadership at all levels, as I mentioned. Also making the case for resources. Many of you, if you've been following the recent activities of the last week, will know that we just completed National Arts Advocacy Day, which is one of, I think probably our more well-known events where advocates from all across the country come in and help make the case to their elected congressional representatives for support for our major cultural agencies. And finally, the third area where we work is in professional services and information. I'm in the research and policy department. I'll be talking about some of the things that we're doing at Americans for the Arts that are related to research that helps make the case, especially for public sector leaders, as to the importance of the arts. I thought I would just do a quick overview of kind of the state of what's happening nationally and some of the budget issues to give, set a context for why we are living in challenging times. We'll just put it that way. We are actually, at the federal level, as most of you know, our main agencies, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, over the past couple of years have been undergoing a lot of struggles as both a result of our economic situation, but also with the change in Congress that has really led to a lot of larger repositioning of the role of government at all levels, not just the arts. To kind of give you an overview of how complicated it has gotten over the last couple of years, we really started out in December 2010 when the Congress failed to pass an FY 2011 budget and ended up having a continuing resolution passed, which kept our cultural agency levels funded at the 2010 levels for a couple of months, which is at $167.5 million. What subsequently happened during 2011 is we were really confronted with a fairly chaotic situation where we were looking at the FY 2012 budget at the same time we were looking at the 2011 budget, and everybody was proposing cuts in the cultural agency budget, including, unfortunately, at one point in 2011, the president, when he announced his 2012 proposed budget. What ended up happening during this period is we had actually managed to hang on to certain things. All proposals were on the table. There was a Republican study committee that recommended as part of its budget package that we should eliminate the cultural agencies. That was the first time we've seen that in a long time, although there's always things that bubble up. We had amendments to further cut the budget, the proposed budget for 2011, which was very significant because this was also the first time that Congress was considering cutting a budget in mid-year. The national budget goes from October to September. So as these debates were happening in January and February, there was the possibility, and in fact it became the reality, that we would be looking at cuts to the federal agencies in mid-year. On the bright side, the cultural community, working with the Congressional Arts Caucus, did manage to restore, although not totally stave off, cuts to the NEA budget for 2011. But we managed to finally, at least for the 2011 base, get $155 million each for the NEA and the NEH, which is $12 million less than the previous year, and 6 months into the budget process. So that's 2011. In the meantime, as all of that was being considered, and 2011 was adopted in April, in February before that, the president released his initial budget for 2012, the fiscal year we're finishing up now. And that initial proposal came out in the total of $146.3 million, which is actually a very tricky thing when you're trying to convince a Congress that wants to cut you that you should approve more than what the president actually approves. So this is sort of the environment that we were working in over this past year in 2011, preparing for this year. Again, a huge amount of amendments to cut even further than that. Possibly the only thing that was a good news story about just how chaotic Congress was last year, and I think you all probably have heard news stories, was that at the end of the day, we managed not to have really devastating reductions to the National Endowment for the Arts. But Congress actually ran out of time before they really finished doing all of the work and business. So what ended up happening last year was they passed just a large omnibus bill taking care of their spending levels and essentially adopting the president's level for 2012. So for this year, we've actually been working with an allocation of $146.3 million. Which is, less, however, it was, on the bright side, it was a compromise between what the House recommended, which was $135 million, and the Senate, still our friends, $155 million. One of the best things, and this is a bright news that everybody should be aware of, is that the Congressional Arts Caucus, which is a bipartisan membership group of representatives from both sides of the aisle. In order to pass the higher level, the 146, which is over the House, we did have 32 Republicans from the House that joined and responded to their colleagues in the Congressional Arts Caucus not to cut back, which, given the climate, was really truly amazing. And really why that happened was really the result of a lot of people at the grassroots level who were in conversation with their elected officials and really made the case for why this was important.
Who are the names of the main representatives in the Congressional Arts Caucus?
It's co-chaired by Louise Slaughter, and on the Republican side is Todd Platts, the Republican from Pennsylvania. There's also a Senate Arts Caucus. If you want the full names, you can go onto the Americans for the Arts website on our advocacy piece, and you basically can, we've got, you can click on your zip code and it'll give you a list of all of your representatives.
I guess I just meant who was the main advocate who helped push the vote through.
It was interesting. It was, on the Republican side, it was co-chair Todd Platts and Mike Simpson from Idaho. Actually gave floor speeches.
Wow.
And there was 30.
I'm wondering, maybe we should pick up some of this conversation, just
Yeah.
go through the panelists, and then we can sort of open it up.
Sure.
And have more of a give and take.
And I'm going to be really, quick now, because I'm exceeding, getting into the NEA. We've been actually been looking at just the general climate. This was a good news story, but it's a 3% reduction at the federal level. For the past 4 consecutive years, we've also been looking at reductions of public sector support at the local level and at the state level in aggregate. From the private sector side, there's just now starting to be, some little stabilization and, reversal of some of this public sector funding. But, we've actually been in a really interesting scenario over the past couple of years of where resources actually have been shrinking. The last thing that I'll say that actually kind of relates to economic impact is one of the research pieces that we've just rolled out is a national arts index that consists of different indicators of health and vitality of the arts industry. One of the things that we've actually looked at is the number of arts, nonprofit arts organizations that have actually been created. And what's interesting for the arts groups, even though, and it's a challenge shrinking resources, we actually have growth in the number of nonprofit arts organizations. The number of nonprofit arts groups grew to 113,000 in 2010. And over the past decade, this actually represents a 49% growth rate, greater than all of their nonprofit organizations, which grew about 32%. So despite the resources, and there's lots of reasons we could talk about what that may actually mean, there still is an explosion and a growing rate of new organizations, new ideas, new rather fertile ground for the arts. Within that, what is particularly exciting, and I think to note, is that the growth of nonprofit culturally and ethnically specific arts organizations, which is an actual designation in the data that we use, has significantly grown. And this was actually, 2010 was the first year that it didn't exceed all growth, but still, the number of cultural and ethnic organizations filing a 990 in 2009 increased by 5% up in 2008. And it's what is, I think, a valuable connection. We could talk a little bit about that is, as we look at the economic impact of the arts industry as a whole and across the country, it's a significant industry with economic impact. The fact that we have a growth in our cultural and ethnically diverse organizations is really contributing to that cultural vibrancy.
What was the overall increase in nonprofits?
The overall increase in nonprofits grew 32% from 2009 to 2010, 1.2 million to 1.6 million.
And of that, 5% is the ethnic growth?
And of that, yes.
No, the growth
Of
rate.
the arts, of the growth rate, yeah.
The growth rate, not the,
Mhm.
not the percentage.
But how does that growth rate match up with the increase in population of diverse people?
That's a really good question, that I don't know.
In 2011, there was a rather significant shift in the nature and the character of the advocacy towards Congress. NEA, very summarily, without discussion of the field, eliminated the Jazz Masters Awards for the nation's greatest jazz artists and the National Heritage Fellowships. And they also tried to take away $5 million that were congressionally mandated to the state arts agencies and put it in any pet project of the chair. And there was an ad hoc coalition of people in the folklore field and also people from the jazz field and also National Assembly state arts agencies. And actually at the congressional hearing, while Rocco Landsman sort of rather blithely said, you know, give us this additional money that we want to take from the allocation for the states and ignore the issue of National Heritage Fellowships, both Republican and Democratic representatives stood up for retaining the awards and also not taking the money away. And Jose Serrano of New York, Congressman Serrano, stood up very boldly for the National Heritage Fellowships. So I want to make the point that this is something that's unprecedented, and rather than a let's get more money from the NEA, it was a critical relationship with the NEA vis-a-vis Congress by these coalitions. So I have two questions related to that. I wasn't aware
Robert,
that...
I'm sorry, I did just want to, if it's okay, just go through the council first, and then we'll just open it
Can I
up.
ask a question later?
Yeah, absolutely. Then we'll have time, we'll have a whole hour. That's why I'm trying to make sure that we get our time in, then we'll have plenty of time for give and take. Yeah, sir. Mitch?
All right, so I'm gonna switch personalities because I also work at Americans for the Arts, and I'm the vice chair of the Association of American Cultures. And sometimes TAC and AFTA have conversations where I have to basically talk to myself. So it's great, and also Neda Martinez is also on the TAC board, so it's great to have the double duty. So the Association of American Cultures started out in 1985 as a convening as an organization of people of color who went actually to a NASA, National Assembly of State Art Agency conference, and said, I think every cultural, diverse person is sort of at the edge of this table. I think we need to have a national, larger conversation about cultural diversity, democracy in the arts, especially around funding. And so since that beginning, that has been the tie to TAC. TAC has had some ups and downs. At the peak, we were a full national service organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. with an executive director. And now we are an all-volunteer organization of about 9 board members, still trying to push the mission of TAC forward. And I got involved about 3 years ago. Before Americans for the Arts, I was the deputy director of grants and programs at the State Arts Commission in Arizona. And I went to TAC's conference, which was called Open Dialogue in Denver in 2008, maybe. And I just thought it was sort of a blah kind of convening. I went to the TAC board and said, I really didn't get much out of this, can we have a conversation? And they're like, how about you get involved? So I did. And ever since then I have been grateful, and I just saw that there was an organizational capacity, a structure, and also I think TAC's audience was a limited audience in this work on cultural democracy and cultural diversity. It had been sort of the same folks around the table since 1985 having this conversation, and so there were new people wanting to get involved that just didn't see themselves in these conversations. So in 2010 we hosted the next Open Dialogue in Chicago, and since that convening it has really been pushing our work. And one of the 3 areas that we found in our Open Dialogue in Chicago was that there are 4 different generations living in the United States right now who all have a different view on what the arts mean, what cultural diversity means, what democracy means. And so we were just in sort of this mode of not wanting to agree to disagree. But when we finally could come to those terms and really start a conversation together, we were able to see the different viewpoints because the boomer and the silent generations, you know, as a Generation X, I was like, oh, they never want to hear our side of the story, but the truth of the matter is, X and Y were not wanting to listen to the older generation sides of the story, who had been fighting a good fight so that we didn't have to see cultural diversity and democracy in a certain way, and also a higher education of college students who never had to think of themselves as ever being diverse or different. We learned that they were looking at terms of equity. They wanted to see equality for everybody, not just certain specific groups. So at Open Dialogue in Chicago, there were 3 frames that came out of it from all different generations, especially dealing with community arts organizations, that there were organizational capacity issues, and around that were funding and leadership. You may recall that just recently I always get their name wrong, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy just put out a report that foundations and corporate giving were not favoring too much of the culturally specific organizations. And we were finding that cultural groups, and this was before the report in 2010, TAC, we were seeing that a lot of culturally specific groups were banging their head trying to get proposals and funding from these groups, and we're not focusing on some other areas. So how can the field really help these community arts groups to think about fundraising in different ways? So what is the 21st century agenda for culturally specific groups in terms of funding? One of the things that I'll jump back to Marete's presentation, TAC got involved on the advocacy side, and we actually sent Nagle to National Arts Advocacy Day this year because TAC feels that it's important that we advocate for public funding, because public funders, just in mandate, fund and recognize culturally specific groups and their needs and their wants, and that they work in different ways. In Arizona, I had a grant program for tribal museums, and we went to an online grant system and expected the entire field until I did some site visits, and I'm like, in the Tohono O'odham Nation, they don't have the internet in their offices, so they can't do an online grant application. So we accessibility issues, so we had to find different ways to access them. So since Open Dialogue, the conversations that we are having in our work is how do we really help organizations think about fundraising in a different way, still going through traditional channels of grants through public funding, but also coming into the 21st century of online giving, a promotion, websites that actually can convey the mission, but are in sort of the ways that the 21st century viewer is looking at them. I was part of a group in Arizona where we listed every single thing we did, and you scrolled and you scrolled and you scrolled and you scrolled until you finally got to the point of what we were trying to do. Well, people don't want to interact virtually in that way. So that being an organizational capacity, the other section of that is leadership. We had great conversations at Open Dialogue about organizations who had leaders who founded the organizations and were very impassioned that the mission be about culturally specific groups. And so coming in, new board members or new talent were having these internal fights about, we need to move forward, but we don't want to change the mission. So how do we become an organization that can keep its mission, but change with the times of being relevant within the 21st century? So rethinking strategies, because new talent want to put a stamp on the organization that they're going to come to lead. So we were trying to find out how to break down barriers with keeping cultural relevancy missions in focus, but moving again towards the 21st century work. So those were the 3 areas that TAC really focused on, and it's been our work since then, and we have been moving very slowly again because of the capacity of what we are, a 9-person board, who also have day jobs, trying to move this work forward. And so we're gearing up for a couple of other convenings in 2012, and we're partnering, and we're finding that partnerships are the way to go, especially in these conversations. So we're partnering with For Culture in Seattle, which is the county-wide local arts agency, to continue these dialogues in regional settings, and also be partnering with Alternate Routes in convening in North Carolina to move this conversation, so that in 2013, we will have our next open dialogue, and we're hoping to take the frames that we learn and field dialogue to be able to move the next phase of this agenda. And the other piece is because of where I sit at Americans for the Arts, we've also been able to use Americans for the Arts to have these kinds of dialogues, and finding on the community arts level, it's not just culturally specific groups. We are seeing in local arts agencies, those are the catalysts for the arts in their community, that out of the 4,000 that we have a database for, half of them are all volunteer run, no staff. They are having budgets of less than $50,000. So we're seeing sort of the renaissance of this cycle of organizations that are now having to build themselves up, and the organizational capacity and the funding and leadership for small organizations is the same parallel fight that we're seeing for culturally specific organizations on the ground. So that's where TAC has put its focus, is really helping culturally specific organizations find their niche as we continue to build the 21st century agenda for cultural democracy in the country. That's what I got. Thanks so much. You're welcome.
Hi, so my name's Paul Nagle. I have a relatively new think tank called Cultural Strategies Initiative. My trajectory of getting there was I started as a playwright and producer. I had a LGBT company that only did new music, theater, and visual art called All Out Arts. We did 5 major festivals before I ended up running Clemente Soto Vélez, which was the venue we were working in. I stepped in the middle of a very horrific sort of battle between artists, visual artists, and Latino companies over the real estate of the building in a city-owned building. Through that, met Alan Gerson, who was then the Community Board 2 chair, and when he got the council member's seat for Lower Manhattan after 9/11, he asked me to be his cultural policy director, and my job there was to figure out strategies for getting culture back on its feet, because when we took office in January, the barricades were still up at Chambers Street. People hadn't had audience for 6 months. What we did there was to create the Arts Advisors to Select Committee, which was 30 executive directors and artists who met monthly for 2 years and created a plan called Campuses and Corridors. And we used that largely to guide the council members' investment strategies, because we were moving a lot of capital money, a lot more than most council members because of the situation down there. And also to take on the LMDC, who was not inclined to give money to small to mid-sized arts organizations, was rather inclined to spend it on legacy projects. And the community really rallied very successfully, and the LMDC ended up giving $70 million out to small and mid-sized cultural, $70 million out to community-based organizations, and then actually did another round this last year. So it was amazing work, and it also gave me a taste for the politics of this and the policy of it. Because when I was producing, I produced about 80 off-Broadway productions over the course of 10 years of only new work. And new work is really all that I'm interested in. Which necessarily put me in very small, very poor company all the time. Because that's where new work happens. And that's really critically important to remember when we're talking about what happens in arts funding, whether it's groups of traditional and ethnic specificity, or it's just small groups. Because they're really getting knocked out of the picture completely. So Cultural Strategies Initiative is my response to all of this. The mission is to strengthen art and culture's central role in civic life and enhance cultural community and environmental sustainability. So what we're trying to do is to use technology and live meetups to bring the data about the arts sector to the sector itself, and have meetings say, does this data represent your lived reality? And if not, what kind of data do we have to generate so that people get it? Because we know how critical the arts are to so many aspects of community life and social organization, but we're not really telling the story. And we're also looking internationally at methodologies and strategies all over the world. And the idea is to look internationally, do test bed sites locally, and then create models that can be replicated nationally and then internationally again. So that's the model that we're working on. In terms of the metrics of being disappeared, part of the problem that I think we're facing is that the data sets that people start with have basically self-selected out to groups that have the capacity and inclination to apply for grants, which is probably, if you look at the cultural ecology of a community, less than 30% of the cultural activity that's happening in any given community. And that's a real problem. So we're actually working with Chris and Cozy out on Staten Island to do community organizing census to identify the cultural ecosystem of Staten Island, and then try and go deeper, if we can raise the money, with a phone survey to try and figure out where the networks are or could exist between the cultural ecosystem, light manufacturing, the maritime industry, and the immigrant populations. And Cozy had approached us. I had made a comment at our launch that I thought that less than 50% of the workforce was counted in terms of economic development, because people who gig together there, which is most of the artists we know, people with combination incomes, generally are not counted in economic impact numbers, as that the work they do in the arts, the taxes they pay on that work is not counted as arts-generated income. And so Cozy approached me, and they were concerned that because the EDC has poured money into the St. George area, and because there's no affordable real estate left anywhere else in proximity to Manhattan, that they would be next in terms of the land grab, and they wanted to create a community bulkhead. So this is our approach to doing this. But there's a lot in that, in terms of what you're talking about getting wiped out of the narrative and the metrics, and also about changing the narrative, because I don't think we're telling our story well, and I think we know what the story is in our hearts. It's really about figuring out what metrics are going to make that story easily transmittable. But what actually I was asked to speak about by my business director, Nicole, when I came here, was social enterprise. So one of the other areas that we're really carving out is in social enterprise. Most of the people that I know are having a very hard time making the 501c3 system work. I did a focus group for a capstone project over at Wagner. Bob Hussein asked me to do it, and I do whatever he asks me to do. And I went there, and it was me and 5 major executive directors, like major companies. And it was for a consulting firm that does capacity building for arts groups. It wanted to change its base of contracts to groups that had more money and could self-pay their contracts. And they weren't going to stop doing smaller to mid-sized groups that had to raise grants to pay for the contracts, but they wanted this new base to pay. And so my eyebrows went right up to my hairline from the beginning, because there's no way that the small to mid-sized is going to survive that imperative. But I participated, and we had a really good session, and at the end they said, does anybody have any reflections, anything that hasn't been said yet? And I said, well, it's kind of an odd time to say it, but if the 501c3 system is as broken as we've all been talking about today, and all this group is doing is training people's capacities to that broken system, what are we doing? I didn't hear any innovation. I didn't hear any new ideas. What's going on? So we really have taken it upon ourselves to try and do some research on some new ideas. And one of the places that we've stumbled into is this world of social enterprise. And social enterprise is this whole new set of corporate structures that are emerging. There's the flexible corporation, there's the benefits corporation, there's the B certified corporation, there's the L3C. And basically the fundamental philosophy behind them is they're commercial or corporations that want to have a social good mission, and they want to be protected from shareholder lawsuits for not maximizing profits. That's the underlying idea of these different structures. When you think about that, commercial companies want to be able to put social good before shareholder value. That's a huge paradigm shift, and it's an open door for us. I think it's also in terms of the way we fundraise. We're doing a community town hall up in the Bronx on the 16th of May, and the call out is to people under 40 to come talk to their elders about how they're producing art, how they're distributing, how they're relating with their audiences. Because kids under 40 don't think the same way. I'm going to be 54 in July, and I think I'm pretty progressive for my age, but these kids blow me away. They just don't see things. They don't see colors. They don't see, problems with gay marriage. I mean, they have a very different way of looking at things, and they have a very different way of engaging. And I think when you're looking at them, you're not looking at people who are going to become a donor to an institution that has a good motto. They're going to fund a project that they can touch, that they can engage with, that they can see the results, that there's low-hanging fruit that helps people, and they'll bundle those investments, they'll across organizations, so there may even be potential for collaboration and partnership among organizations to present a menu of interesting ideas. We're looking at ways to go into the financial houses with leads, people who place the tech kids in the financial houses, and who in the financial houses might be interested in forming support guilds, very, sort of close-knit. And that kind of work is very time-consuming, but anyone who's trying to work with foundations now knows that the money is being pointed to a very small strata of organizations. And if anybody was at the Monday presentation of the Vibrancy Index, was anybody there for the Art Place program? It was shocking. It was shocking. The Vibrancy, they're saying that you'll measure your outcome of success by having a destination place. The population of people that will metric success is young, upwardly mobile professionals. The businesses that will metric success are retail, service, and personal service. And at one point they were looking, I was shocked. And I'm probably going to get myself in trouble by being this frank, but the reception outside afterwards, everybody was kind of like, oh my God. And the people from Staten Island were particularly not pleased because they actually are also looking at they're not creating any new data. They're only looking at publicly available data sources, and they're not asking grantees to generate any data about what they do. It's all going to be by these publicly available. One of them is cell phone data, so they can see how many people are in a 100 square meter cell. And agglomerations of people throughout the day and night is what they're looking for as a vibrancy index. So when they showed the picture they were showing different maps, and they showed the map of New York City's cell phone agglomeration, and Staten Island and the Bronx weren't on the map. So we have a problem. And I feel like we cannot look to the status quo to solve this problem for us. We have to get out there and do a lot of community grassroots organizing the sort of old-fashioned way and take control of the narrative again.
Thank you so much. And with us is Sonia. Sonia is Vice President for the Institutional Partnerships and Chief Diversity Officer at Wesleyan University. You all have her bio here, and we're very grateful to you for making it this afternoon, and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, thank you. So hello everyone, Sonia Manjon. Sorry for being late. We drove up from Connecticut with some of my students and my sons, and we encountered trees being cut down in the middle of the highway, road work, traffic. But we're very happy to be here. I've been working on a project with Dr. Martha Morena Vega for the last 4 years, a snapshot of 12 cultural arts organizations throughout the country. And this project evolved out of conversations that we've been having over the last decade, literally, of equity in funding and resources for community-based organizations that actually have a grounding in communities of color and have a history of anywhere from 30 to 45 years in existence. And the reason for this snapshot of these cultural arts organizations nationally is as we look at funding policies nationally, what we have seen anecdotally is the same thing that has been highlighted through Occupy Wall Street, is that you have the 1% and you have the 99% of wealth in this country. And that is also a parallel that we're seeing in state and federal funding resources and policy, is that you have the major sort of European-based organizations, ballet, symphony, operas, that receive, up to 99% of both state, local, and federal funding, and you have the rest of the 1% that's being distributed between many cultural arts organizations and individual artists. And so there's this disparity that exists with these funding resources and the way that they're being allocated. This last economic demise that we have all just experienced hit a lot of our community cultural arts organizations really hard in terms of you have even further limited resources, and when you look at the major funding agencies such as National Endowment of the Arts, New York Council of the Arts, California Arts Council, that a lot of the programs that were established in the 70s that basically supported these arts organizations such as Expansion Arts, multicultural art and entry grant programs in California, that when the resources began to diminish, those were the first funding resources that were basically wiped out. And so you had a lot of organizations that were developed based on the 501c3 model that were very dependent on government funding. And so then when that government funding isn't there and you don't have the resources on those boards of directors, such as someone that sits on a board of directors of a major ballet, opera, or symphony that can pull out their checkbook, and write a $10,000 check, then you really get the crippling of these organizations. So one thing that we decided to do was really look at the funding policies over the years in relationship to how these organizations have actually been able to sustain themselves. And I think it's really interesting that most of the organizations that we looked at now have facilities in which they are either long-term leasing or have built that they're trying to sustain in addition to the cultural product that's being put out. And so there's in terms of keeping these organizations alive. The organizations that we are including in this publication, which will be out soon, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, we looked at the Association of Hispanic Arts, which actually had to close its doors. And we thought that it was really critical to look at a variety of organizations, even if they were no longer with us, because there is a lot of cultural history that I think has not been documented, that we really wanted to make sure that we're documenting how they came about, who are the major artists that took place in building these organizations. The American Indian Contemporary Arts Organization, which had a location in San Francisco, and when we saw the .com that happened in California that started in the Silicon Valley, that moved into the San Francisco area, a lot of the owners of buildings where a lot of these cultural arts organizations existed said we can get a lot more money from these .comers. So the arts organizations got pushed out, the rents went up, and they were left to struggle for their very existence. And so as a result of that, this very important museum that was in the San Francisco Bay Area no longer has a facility. And so they've moved into trying to preserve their archive of arts work. TAC, which you heard from, which is the headquarters located in Lincoln, Nebraska, but is that correct now?
It's just our
It's
PO
an
box.
address.
So
We
we're
can write in the heartland.
We're listing you in Lincoln, Nebraska. It actually looked good for the report because we were able to get the whole United States represented, which we
can
otherwise
be in there
we wouldn't have. But TAC takes on more of a national looking at these types of funding disparities and inequities that exist for culturally based organizations. The National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures, NALAC, which is in San Antonio, Texas, has done really well in terms of building its visibility and building its funding base. And so, they have been very fortunate develop and sustain, but the name in terms of a national service-based organization that really supports other Latino-based organizations that has done very well. The Manchester Bidwell Corporation or Manchester Craftsmen's Guild Bill Strickland in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I mean, that organization is phenomenal in terms of what he has been able to, Bill Strickland, build through economic development. And so he has based his work in the cultural arts of a community, but from an economic perspective, and has surrounded himself very, very strategically with Republicans, which he is, but nevertheless, he has looked at, how do I sustain this organization in terms of building capital, and has done so very, very effectively. One thing that we found interesting from those interviews is that, he has a multi-million-dollar operating budget, which he literally raises every year. So there again, we see that, one bad year for him, and a lot of things go by the wayside. We also looked at St. Joseph Historical Foundation, or the Haiti Heritage Center in Durham, North Carolina, which has also a facility, has a historical site, which was an old church, the church that the African American community of the late 18th century, early 19th century was built around. And so they looked at that historic site as really being the pillar of that community, which has gone through a lot of transitions in terms of both economic development of that community and also representation of African Americans. They have been able to extend and build on to that historic site. So in terms of having a facility which has its headquarter office in Atlanta, Georgia, but serves some parts of Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and really comes out of that history of cultural struggle from, and not from a 501c3 perspective, although they have become a 501c3, but they come out of a history of the civil rights movement, as many of these do, but really being true to that process of even their earlier structure was based on a collaborative. And the collaborative had to agree to how they were going to promote themselves and how they were going to fundraise and how they were going to, develop their cultural work and how they were going to present that cultural work. And so they developed these really wonderful models where they didn't even use executive director or artistic director. Their leadership was based on, head lettuce, or a master tomato. Really to break down that kind of stereotypical knowledge of we have to base ourselves, after this European model. They really said, let's look at where we come from in terms of a struggle. They came out of the Highlander Center, where Rosa Parks actually went to study organizing before she started the Montgomery bus boycott. And so they wanted to really maintain that history of community activism at that really grassroots level. But then, as we know, to continue to do the work that we do, that we sometimes have to acquiesce to the funder's structure, which is if you don't have a 501c3 model, then who's your umbrella organization? And then you have an umbrella organization that takes, 10 to 20% of the funding that you get, which leaves you with nothing to do the work that you do. And so there's this catch-22 of, having to fit into this model for your very existence. Another thing that we looked at is the browning of America and the importance of the sustainability of these organizations because they are serving our communities. I was able to locate this very important map of Americans Tomorrow by PolicyLink, which is located in the Bay Area, and it has these snapshots of the changing demographics of America from 1990 through 2040. And I don't know if you can see it back there, but in 1990, you have very little browning in the maps of the United States. By the time you get down to 2040, you literally have a majority of brown-skinned people in major cities across the country. And we thought that this was really important in terms of framing the conversation because we're talking about our communities. We're talking about our children. We're talking about you know, a country that really has to come to terms with itself, where we're moving to and who is going to, you know, be the major constituencies, you know, that we will either have to deal with because we know how to deal with it or because we're gonna have to deal with it. You know, and a lot of institutions, educational institutions such as Wesleyan, you know, we're having those discussions in terms of who are gonna be, you know, our future students here. We're looking at the elementary schools, and in most major cities across the country, your elementary schools are predominated by brown-skinned children. That's where our country is going. And so it's very interesting for me to be located in New England, you know, which is sort of this bastion of the, you know, early European settlers and the whole patriarchal system, you know, that has developed our country. And having these discussions when I come from a place like California that has, you know, most of the residents in the state of California are brown-skinned individuals, you know. So I feel like I've gone into this time warp and back in time where I'm having discussions that, you know, I probably had 30 years ago, you know, in California. And so this study is very important, I think, because it says a lot about our communities, our cultural organizations, how they have sustained themselves over the 30 years. There's a piece that we put in here that looks at the historical context. And in one of our earlier discussions, we had A.B. Spellman, who for many, many years was the head of the Expansion Arts program at the National Endowment of the Arts, who, now that he's retired, could really tell us the real story, you know, behind what was going on. And we were really happy that he was very forthright with us and we were able to document a different perspective, you know, of National Endowment of the Arts and how that whole funding source came about. We were also able to have John Kalaki, who was with the San Francisco Foundation in San Francisco, and who's now in Maine, but his realization was that most of the funders that were making decisions had no cultural context of the organizations that they were funding. And so how could they be developing the types of policies that they were developing and making the decisions when, you know, there was sort of no background understanding of doing that. And so he's kind of looking at this in hindsight, and I'm saying, why didn't you come to that understanding when you were in that funder's seat? Because that's where it would have really made a world of difference. And then we had Holly Sitterfield, who just published a report, Fusing the Arts, that begins to start to document the funding policies and practices of many of these national, private, and public funders. And it documents in dollars and cents just how inequitable the funding has been as a result of the policy. So what we're doing is, you know, really contextualizing where our organizations are and why they're where they are today. And I'm gonna let my co-author say a few words.
That's something more than comprehensive. I know you had a burning question. Did you want to jump in because we're here till 4 o'clock today?
Oh,
I'm
okay,
sure it's still burning your.
Well, 2 points. First of all, the Special Ed Services program of the New York State Council on the Arts is still very much alive. It wasn't eliminated. Decreases have been commensurate with the rest of the council, so it didn't follow the pattern of expansion arts. But the question about the situation in 2011, what was AFTA's position on the elimination of the National Heritage Fellowships and the other and the Jazz Masters? Did AFTA take a position? So I wasn't aware of it.
Actually, the Americans for the Arts takes a position on the overall budget for the NEA, and quite honestly, the NEA, just the one thing I did want to answer about your thing is every single chairman that takes that position at the National Endowment for the Arts comes in with their own agenda. And prior to, you know, the shift in everything, a lot of the budgets were earmarked for certain types of things in the Dana Gioia generation, which was Shakespeare, the Big Read, you know, some of the other things that actually have come out. I would honestly have to go back and look And see, I don't think we took an official position on how all of those were allocated. And normally if we did, because we're the professional service organization for local arts agencies, the program that we're particularly interested in, which was also during many restructurings, at one point in time phased out and brought in and reduced, is funding for local arts agencies and grassroots development. The NEA, historically, it was really, we had a high budget in 1992 of 176 million. So you can see 1992, we are nowhere near where we actually were. We are actually building it up. And what happened was when Congress and the contract with America, the new Gingrich Congress, really forced the issue with the NEA. We lost programs like Expansion Arts. We also lost two programs that were just about the best in terms of building infrastructure, which was the Challenge Grant and the Advancement Program. And they created, sort of these soft, more thematic areas where people are applying for larger issues. When in 1992, we lost direct artist fellowships, the only fellowships that remained were jazz masters. So again, all of these kinds of policies, where did the funding go? Is it equitable? Is it desirable? Probably not. But the latest per capita figure of what we spend as Americans per person to fund the National Endowment for the Arts is 47 cents. State arts agencies aggregate, 87 cents per person. Locals, $2.25. I did the math this morning. Wow, $3.56 per capita for the entire public sector support. But if you like, I can actually go back to our government affairs team and find out if we actually did any. I can't see us.
Jazz Masters and National Heritage Fellows, I'm just making a simple point, is that was very much an equity issue and an example of world elitism. So that's the point.
Well, did you want to comment on, I saw some themes coming out around race, place, location. Did you want to speak to perhaps like the organizing and engagement? Because in a way, my concern has been with the Browning of America, our numbers are such that we should be in a way self-sustainable. So I'm trying to think, where did we make a mistake? Where did we go wrong? Is it that sometimes we're doing so much in terms of our art production that we're in our head and we're not really kind of bringing the community with us as a part of the art making process?
I think most of the groups that I know are pretty embedded in their communities. You can't really survive if you're not. What's happened is we made a deal and an equation where we would subsidize entry to our products, and then funders would subsidize us on the back end.
Right.
That contract has been broken, and we're still subsidizing on the front end
Exactly.
because that's what people expect to pay now, and that's what they're going to pay. We had a meeting in Queens last week, and there were a lot of musicians there, and they were saying that we used to be able to go into bars and get paid to play in bars, and it was good for business, and it was good for us. But now there's so few venues that kids are going in and offering to play for free. So the bar owner's like, why the hell would I pay you if I can pay somebody for free? And that's, we devalue ourselves in these processes, and also by, right now to make my organization work, I'm paying myself $38,000 a year. That is like really hard to live in New York City on, but I'm going to do it until my organization is stabilized. And I don't want to do that for 10 years though, you know what I mean? But that's what people do. They get into you're running an organization that's all volunteer, which is great, but it shouldn't be the only activity in the ecology. And there's so much willingness to participate out there, and so much willingness with people to engage. I don't know if you know about Figment, the arts festival out on Governor's Island. It's quintuples any other attendance of any other event on Governor's Island, is absolutely 100% volunteer run, and it's now in 7 cities this summer. The participatory culture that's brewing out there is kind of magnificent, and I also we are an overtly social justice organization. we're housed in Demos, which is a progressive think tank. And we make no bones about that. My work is a marriage of my concern for arts and my concern for the environment. But we have a role to play, and I actually just got published on Monday, and I have the essay here for everybody, in a new book by Raj Isar. We have a role to play in saving the world and turning around this dynamic of 99 and 1. We have a major role to play, and if we can make ourselves more relevant in everything that we do, I think that's going to be a key to survival.
I think also cultural production is changing when you look at the younger generations and how they're, producing art and making art. It's very, very different from, the older ones of us, that did cultural production where you needed to have your artistic director and your technical director and your executive director, and you had a grant writer to bring the money in, if you were lucky. If not, it was kind of your executive director / artistic director that was, trying to do the production and raise the money and sustain, the facility wherever it was you're doing it. But, the younger generation, with technology, the production is very, very different. I mean, the music industry is really having to change the way that it's producing music, because of that. And I'm also seeing that, the 25s and under are looking at these structures very differently. They're not gravitating towards these 501c3s at all. Yeah. And they're it's really good, and they're more global in terms of their outreach. They're not just looking at a community. They're looking at a diasporic community, and they're traveling. And how they're doing it off of not using the financial system. I think that we need to start looking at how that's happening. I mean, they're going to Brazil, they're going to South America, they're, going to Europe, and they're collaborating and engaging with other young artists around the world. And so they're very global in terms of their understanding of art and culture, and have really gravitated away from, this structure that have gotten us into this, is it the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog paradigm of having to chase the funding and being so codependent and dependent on these funding agencies where the policies were never really established in a sustainable way to support, what we have built, and in that, I have to say that, I'm very proud that we did this work, because when you look at the sustainability of these 12 organizations, and all but 2 of them, one has closed its doors and one doesn't have a facility to try and upkeep, that they have done a really amazing job, at the outreach and the cultural production that they've done.
There's a few things on my mind about this, and one definitely is that the younger generations, and I'm even thinking younger than myself, just want to participate in the arts differently. They want to make it. They're happy making their video on YouTube and calling it a day. They don't need to sell it for anything. They want to, it is becoming the hobby generation for arts and culture. But they also don't want to pay to go into a black room for you to show you your wares and then leave. They want to experience the arts. They want to participate. They want to touch it. So I really think that generation is thinking about it in a very different way. And in my previous life, I would talk to capstone classes at colleges and universities and talk about public funding for the arts. And what was really astounding was that the response of, why would I want government money to do my art making? I don't want to touch that. That's not where I want to live. And we're seeing the younger generation in more of a libertarian mindset on a lot of different efforts, including I don't want my art subsidized on government funding. There's too many strings attached, and you have to break down some perceptions about that. So those funding interests on the younger generation. And the last piece on participation is that our arts organizations need to think about participation in a different way. There was the study between Wallace Foundation and the RAND Center that really talked about what kind of participation you're after. When you talk to a cultural group who say, oh, I want to diversify my audience, well, how are you doing that? Oh, we gave free tickets. Well, who did you give them to? If you're really trying to diversify, that's going after a very different person. If you're just wanting to engage with the same people in your neighborhood, that's broadening, you know, or you just wanting to have a deeper relationship. People don't understand the different kinds of participation, and it's really drawing people into a different way. They say, I did everything in my power, and now I'm done. Well, maybe you didn't do things right, and so the last thing is, when do you just let an organization turn out the lights and call it death? And let them die gracefully, instead of trying to just keep going on, when those energies could be diverted into a different way, so that these community programs could, you know, live in a different life.
Could I jump in?
I think that-
Yes, please.
I think that there's a mixing, and I think that we have to clarify this mixing. There's a difference between individual artists experimenting and the building of institutions. I mean, when we all started out, we were individual artists and going for it, you know, being hungry and all of it. It's when we begin to landmark these institutions and stabilize the institutions so that artists that didn't have access, let's say, to major institutions would have walls at least to hang their work on. So I think that we have to see the difference between individual production and institution building. Those are two separate things. And I think that it's very clear, at least in terms of the work I've been doing over time and in terms of what we're seeing now, is that a lot of the major institutions are doing the work that community groups are not funded to do, right? So the Med can have a multicultural whatever, you know, the Lincoln Center people can have a multicultural whatever, and foundations funded that, right? But when we were doing that work, it wasn't funded. So that there's a valuing question in terms of what this country believes is valuable and not valuable.
Right.
And I think that young people now have access to technology that obviously we didn't have then. But I think that the creative energy was the same and the adventure spirit was the same. You just have different tools to work with. But if you look at the graffiti movement, for example, it was happening on walls. Now it's a movement that's happening in major galleries throughout the world, right? So that if you do that comparative analysis, the question is, what is valued in this country? And if it's presented by a particular group, is it more valued than if it's presented by the people that created it, right?
I also want to jump in terms of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you don't have a 501c3, you can't get access to the money right now. So you're going to have a 501c3, as clumsy and stupid as it may seem. And letting organizations go under means that those people who were producing through that organization don't have a way to produce anymore. So there's reasons to keep groups alive. I think that part of the problem is that everything's also focused on the production end of the chain. And a lot of the value of what happens, real estate developers know this really well, is at the creative end of the chain, in that creative practice. And that a country would consider not funding arts, would consider not funding education in this global economy is just nuts. It's nuts. And so part of what we have to do is turn that conversation around too, and the narrative around, because it's not necessarily what the government does for us, but what we do for the government. And in terms of art and culture, I mean, artists have a skill set in creative practice that is a very specific skill set that is very advantageous for a lot of different processes. Scientists, when they get the creatives in the room, are amazed at what happens. Planners, you know, it's fun to watch planners get exposed to artists in the room for the first time. Artists have a very specific way of building up and breaking down things that's really important for innovation. In the same way that scientists get paid to go into a laboratory and experiment, they don't necessarily produce a product, they produce outcomes that help decide where the inquiry goes next. I think the government must be funding that creative process with artists. I don't think we should let the government off the hook. I think we should be pushing harder than ever for government funding. But I also would tell arts groups to try and make government funding a smaller part of your portfolio, especially since it's so volatile.
I think, and just sort of following up with the statistics that you put out, I'm wondering where the growth in the nonprofit is, because a lot of the Wall Street people have developed nonprofits. And I don't think that there's any data really saying what the growth process, or who's investing in that growth process. So that now you have a lot of nonprofits of people who are wealthy and left, Wall Street developing nonprofits. And even who's developing these nonprofits of color, and what's the structure that's developing them. Because it's easy to put out a figure, but if you don't see behind sort of the curtain or the immediate door, we don't know what that movement is infused by.
Yeah, we have another stat from our National Arts Index that says, I think every 4 hours a new arts nonprofit is created, and 1 in 4 of those, or maybe it's even more, 2 in 4, half of them will have a deficit by the end of their fiscal year. So we're not seeing the sustainability of these organizations, but how can, it's some professional education on how to work with these, because I think the first thing, especially with talking to people, it's like, well, I'll make a nonprofit, then we'll make it. And it's like, do you know what that means? Do you have the idea and the plan to make this work? It just doesn't give you this magic wand to do certain things. So I think there's also a level of professional education, as you were talking about earlier, with these institutional building of organizations to make sure that they are sustainable moving forward and making sure that their mission is of value to their community.
Actually, I want to get back.
There's another piece, and it goes to Paul's piece. How do you get government to meet its responsibility in terms of equitable distribution of resources? It's as basic as that, because if you go across the country, most government resources are going to the 1%. So that my question then is, what is tax role? What is Americans for the Arts role in creating the climate that questions this, right? Because that's what you all were developed for. So I want more than just saying, we're getting more arts money, because if the arts money is going to the same people, then what do I care about supporting the arts movement or TAC?
And the foundations,
you know what I'm saying?
need to be.
Now, who's calling them to task? Nobody's calling them to task.
The foundations need to be called to task in the same way. I mean, if you look at that art place and the metrics that I was talking about before, they are aiming at arts organizations that have the capacity to work with banks and work with local governments.
Absolutely.
That's all that they're targeting right now.
So, actually, getting back to the data piece, I also want to put out that I really, one thing you said that really resonated with us is just really the insufficiency of the data that we actually have. We're tracking things that is based on that 501c3
Absolutely.
model. The 501c3 model favors the mix of public and private sector support that was created over 50 years ago by philanthropists who wanted a way to figure out how to channel arts dollars, and they had a particular sensibility, and they were trying to recreate the European cultural model in their cities through the public and private model. That doesn't work for small emerging groups, and it doesn't necessarily work for the majority of, just in terms of the poor artist who, just to get an investment, has to come up with an organization, and then now they're reporting, now they're doing the tax thing, now they're doing the financing, and you can't you just don't have the capacity to do that. But right now, that is the model
But it's not an
that
issue
we
of
have.
capacity, it's an issue of where you're starting, that it doesn't make sense. So then who puts that conversation out there in terms of framing a different conversation?
No, but I think the conversation is actually out there, and actually, it's interesting because we're actually having several sessions looking at the different models aspect at our convention. It's something that, strangely enough, we've posed as a member of grant makers in the arts, because a lot of our member organizations are funders. So we're an affiliate of grant makers in the arts, which is mostly a private foundation. This will be the second year that we're running a session at their conference that's actually talking with them about, how do you, and the thing is, unlike the public sector, as mediocre as it may be, the public sector, when you apply for funds, includes there is some, at least, incentives to try to, reach different audiences. It doesn't solve the question of, culturally and ethnically specific funding. That's another thing. But
No, but
the private
question is of
funders,
equitable funding.
Yeah.
You can take the ethnic issue and the race issue out of it. The question is, how do you equitably fund?
And those are the conversations that in local arts advancement we are having with our local arts agency members, especially the grant makers, because even and especially urban centers, they're no longer wanting to fund the SOBs, the Symphony Opera Ballets. They are wanting to get into more community efforts, but they're not sure on how to do it without the big question on the table in some of our larger local arts grant makers who, the majority of local arts agencies now are nonprofit organizations. They're no longer, they may get some subsidy from the government, but they're their own nonprofit, they're making up their rules, and they're wanting to shake up their programming, and a lot of them want to strip general operating support in a way so that those larger organizations have to meet a certain standard about what they're doing in their community. And so they're having this real gut-wrenching conversations because they also don't want to get into the political message. You said earlier that the backers of those larger institutions are the political backers that are like the mob and could put them out into the river if they don't fund in certain ways. In Tucson, Arizona, Roberto Bedoya, who didn't fund a big chunk of his majors. He said, you didn't meet the benchmarks, you didn't get a good score, you don't get any money. And it blew up, but it has created a sense about civic engagement in grant dollars. His grant dollars are very limited, especially on the public side, and it had to shake this up. And so he was a pioneer in doing that, and it's really the conversation that we are having about equitable funding, especially in the local arts agency funding world. But we have a lot of our locals who say, I could lose my job if I do this. And it's like, maybe you gotta take one for the team then, if that's what you're really going after. So these are what we're seeing on the local arts side. So, our government affairs side and some policy and research is focused on this government national issue. And the reason why we do it is because if the national level folds in whatever capacity it's in, the states and locals, those authorizers are ready to take just the same kind of action. But we want to have those conversations on the grassroots level, and it is starting to happen with that equity in funding. And we do have a few sessions, but beyond sessions and conference talk, we're wanting to get to the root of what communities are thinking. And it was very brave for some people to say, I don't want to fund the majors anymore. I want to flip the scale, but how do I do it? And that's where we are finding our head against the wall of how do you do it without blowing things up? And I think you just got to blow it up to make it happen.
Wow. I think it's a really
Well,
hard.
I think I can jump in. Can you just state your name and affiliation for the camera,
Sure.
please?
Chris Millet, I work for the Council on the Arts and Humanities for Staten Island. I'm the director of folk art
You've been
there.
so patient.
No. Should I talk to the camera? Are we live? I agree with you. I work for this Arts Council as a folklorist, and I work with a lot of different traditional artists, and they are really interested in being leaders in their communities. A lot of foundations and other entities are coming at us saying we want to do community-based arts, and we want them to fill out this grant. The amount of work it takes to get those grants written is incredible. I mean, it's a lot of work. So it's almost like I feel like people throw money at it, but are they really dedicated to it? Because if they were, they would really understand that we have a great opportunity to make leaders out of those traditional artists, those communities, and that is where the payoff would be. They would continue, they would pass it down to their kids, but I just wonder if people are really committed to that, because that's really what needs to be done, I think. But I'm happy to see those dollars come our way.
Lillian, you were wanting to jump in?
I can't remember at what point.
Jump in anyway.
I think I was thinking about just, two different kind of, spheres that the arts community. We're talking about the newer kind of generation of non-501c3 models that are kind of a resurgence of, it's kind of shaping the field right now. At the same time, there are institutions that are around for 30 years that she's studying that are trying to establish an institution. And that's a whole different agenda from the conversation that's happening on the ground, that involve those communities of color. So I just wonder if there's ways to mobilize the energy that's coming from the field that are not just the individual artists, but actually those collectives and those kind of enterprises or small business models that are coming out of the creative sector, and then bridge that to the institutions that are being built, because those are only going to be a handful of institutions that are going to come to the surface. Those are the groups that are going to get, they have their 501c3, they are part of the system, they have government funding, you know, obviously there has to be more, but they already tapped into the system, they're in the system versus what's outside the system. I just feel like that these worlds are kind of operating, you know, on different planes, but the benefits of both parts of the sector should be somehow harnessed or something, and make a compelling statement that reaches beyond the arts sector, because I feel like we talk to ourselves. These conversations really are about having the conversation come out of the arts sector, and you're in the room where you're the only arts person in the room, and you get everyone on board. That's where we're going to see any change. I mean, we've been having the same conversation for 15, 20 years, and I mean, I know, and I've seen a lot of it's a different lens, but I don't think we really. I mean, obviously we haven't, because the dollars show it. The institutions haven't changed. I don't want. I'm going to sound kind of frustrated, but it is basically the same story, and I feel like only if we get out of this community will we see anything happen. And I think the numbers have to do something. And maybe we've talked about numbers, metrics, but what kind of metric would make sense? Do we have to talk to the business sector? The pulp, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback off of what Lillian's saying.
Would you say your name for the camera?
Sorry, my name is Cynthia Lee. I was really heartened to hear what Paul had to say about metrics and about process, because I think it is about, I'm tired of these arguments that I have to make about economic development. That, the work that I do brings an X number of new dollars into this 6-block radius, and it's, going to improve society in that way. Because exactly what you're saying, that so much of our work had to do with the process, and had to do with the very fact that we were working together and collaborating with people not only next door to us, but also other communities. And the arts tends to do that. The arts tends to bring people across, neighborhoods and cities, and I think that's the true vibrancy. It's not the number of cell phones, but it's really this process. And so, a lot of times I felt like my work was not really just the product. The product was a great way to sort of say, hey, this is what we do. This is an example of the kind of stuff that we can do, but really so much of the work was 95% the back end. And what it meant to be able to provide a place for people to see another possibility, right? Different ways of doing things. And I think I feel like that's missing from our message in terms of community health and community development. And so I would be, and so many of our organizations can't do the work to do that research, to make that case. We know it anecdotally, and we know it over time. But, I feel like nobody's really looking at that aspect of the work and the impact of that work, that social impact of the work, and translating it into numbers that, government officials want to hear.
Well, I think part of the problem is trying to fashion the argument for government officials, because government officials come and go really quickly at the local level.
Right.
And they want things, that are very immediate. They don't have, their view is like this far. I feel like the argument really has to be for everybody, for the public, so that the public starts getting literate in this narrative. And in terms of social justice, I mean, I'm working with somebody on a class on art and social justice, and at the first meeting I said, so social justice is not the same thing that it was 40 years ago. When 99% of the people have nothing and 1% have everything, social justice is a very different question now. And we can be leaders in that conversation. And I think that we also, we've been very passive in certain ways. Real estate, when you produce a piece of art, there's value in the art that you produce. There's also value there's equity in the fact that you're creating in a place. ways. And real estate developers have captured that hook, line, and sinker, and they monetize it. And they don't give anything back to us. So if it can be monetized, then that's a process, and we need to figure it out, and we need to work together through community organizing to hold back and demand some leverage during that monetizing process so that there's community development in balance with economic development. Because economic development's sole metric, when you come down to it, is rising land values.
Please comment.
Yeah, hi, Jan Cohn-Cruz. To Cynthia's point about nobody's kind of documenting the process being as important as the product, there are lots of people documenting it. Community Arts Network used to be full of it on its pages, and you can still see that documentation. If you go to that website, they've frozen it from when they lost the funding to be able to keep producing. But I only named them as one site. There are other places, and there are other people doing it. And I couldn't agree with you more about that these are conversations that have to happen across sectors. People who write about the work have the same problems that people who make the work have, which is that we don't live in a society that recognizes the social value of art. That to try to, I mean, I once thought, what would it take to get a piece in the New Yorker? Just as, yes, there's government, there's all kinds of people you would like to have read this work. It takes a long, long time to circulate. And I mean, what you need with having the kind of agent and the number of people trying to get I mean, just using the New Yorker as an example, which is supposed to be for people who are intellectually curious, culturally caring, and that they'll read about things that aren't just their own discipline. But it's so competitive to try to get into venues, but I don't think it's less important. And so I just want to say, it's not that there aren't people writing it, it's that they're having a very hard time getting it placed in cross-sector contexts.
I mean, there are some really great studies already, especially in Philadelphia.
And other kinds of writing, not just studies, but
it's not,
more juicy kinds of writing.
I guess what I'm saying is for the organizations themselves, every day, every year, you know, we're trying to raise money for our operating.
Yeah.
Right? Every year, millions of dollars we have to raise. So, you know, we're not endowed the way, you know, the Metropolitan might be, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that the arguments that we're being fed to try to make are usually the economic development ones. And it's usually because the foundations or, you know, are asking for those specific metrics when we're writing our, you know, grants. I guess what I'm just saying is that, you know, I feel like it's a time for this larger narrative to come rise up and for us to have those cross-sector conversations so that we have access to that information, that we're talking, you know, and so that we can then, you know, bring that in.
And I would say cross-sector and also cross-geography, because one of the real problems that we've had in the U.S. is not looking outside the U.S. at what's going on around the world, and there's some amazing work on social impact metrics going on around the world. And part of that has been the rest of the world's attitude towards us, which is shifting really fast now. Because I used to try and talk to my cultural counterparts in Europe, and they'd be like, yeah, it's apples and oranges, really not the same systems at all. There's no use. But now that the Netherlands has cut their cultural budget by 45%, Bulgaria is shutting down all of its institutions, Portugal has eliminated its Ministry of Culture, Italy's a mess, the UK's a mess, suddenly everybody wants to talk. And it's a moment of opportunity, but we're working with a group, in my essay I referred to it, but there's a group called International Futures Forum out of Scotland. And they are working on a taxonomy of economies that occur in social organizations that have nothing to do with money and can't be measured by money, but are critical to the functioning of social organization. And in each economy they identify a currency, and they've identified art as the currency in the economy of meaning, which is such a great frame.
Bill Ivey has a nice friend. He was the NEA chair in the second Clinton administration. I recently heard him on a panel talking about trying to find language, since some people hear the word art, they think, oh, that's too highfalutin. They hear the word culture, they think culture wars. So he's been playing with sort of similar to what you just said. He was thinking about what are the realms of life that are respected. So there's economic life, there's family life. So what about expressive life? So, but I mean, I think this language to try to put us on par with the other arenas is one of our tasks.
And also embracing the UN conventions on culture, because they really have the UN convention that creative expression is a right
Yeah.
is huge. It's
But the
a
fact
great,
that the US hasn't signed off on it is critical.
right, but that's,
It's critical, so that's the issue. You know,
Well,
the issue
I
is
don't-
the language is out there, and all of our I would say, most of the community-based organizations are based on meaning. And they've always used that language. And they've used the language of the UN. I think that the question is, how do you shift the paradigm from the 1% to the 99?
right.
I mean, and it goes to your point, how do you blow it up? You know what I mean? How do you blow it up? It's as basic as that, we know that.
Well, and also, who is sort of, the only term I can think of is, who's the police? I mean, who do we go to then when we say, I don't think that fairness is happening? We
IRS.
report it to the BBB, yes, but there are some organizations, I did theater for many years, and I finally got out of it because I really liked some mainstream plays, and I thought, well, maybe I'm not getting cast because I'm not good, and I'm like, well, maybe it's because I'm young, and I was like, well, no, because Neil Simon didn't write for, brown people. Why can't I be in the show? But there was nobody that I could complain to that it would go to any kind of level to move it up. But it's how do we shift those roles?
The police are the people who are keeping everything in place. Let's look at it clearly. It's been structured this way for a very good purpose. That is to eliminate our ability to promote our own cultures and our belief systems, and to impose all of the things that we've learned in order to operate in English. And we've learned to do that, and they've created an economy and a way of monetizing the system that says, wow, life is going to get better, everything's going to get better, so we all jump on. So I have all these Asian community people who are just silent because things are better than in China, Why should they complain? They just have to ride on the backs of the system that keeps pumping it up and going. Now that the system is not pumping it up, then, some people are getting worried. And now maybe we see this is an opportunity to get someplace. But I think that clearly we have to be honest about ourselves. What is the nature of the battle? The battle is that this is not just the opportunity for us to say that there's not just one culture in this world. There are other cultures, and we have to find a way to compromise. And the energy is not going to come from convincing funders to give us more money. The energy is going to come when we get our own communities to see that they can't just ride on the backs of a culture that's going to keep them happy. They're going to have to realize that this is the time for them to own their own communities, control their own communities, make their own culture in the communities, not just be something for tourists to go to, but to really take ownership of who America is. And until we find that kind of affirmation from our own communities and generate that, we shouldn't be just going to funders or other people to say, hey, give me equity. No, we're going to have to, equity is going to come when we can fight and sustain our own equity. So when we look at OWS is the one place I think that's having this kind of conversation, which is saying 99% this is where we should be owning. And we got to shift the whole pattern. So we don't want to just, allow money coming in from the funders who are going to, let that game of playing catch up of how they operate that level of economy, whereas our communities operate on this level of economy. We're somewhere in the middle. You call that groups that now want a commercial license, but don't want to be holding to their shareholders to raise that they want to do social good. We're somewhere, I would think, we're moving in we've got to play, how does that game going to work to make it so we move that way, so we're all volunteers because we love it, because it's an economy of meaning and not just an economy of dollars and cents. Once we can begin to agree on those big metaphysical questions, or at least begin to realize that despite how you structure those rationally, those metaphysical questions, we love each other. And then we can embrace each other. And then we can build a culture. If that's where we're moving, then I think we can begin to understand how we need to strategize here so that we can make this kind of linkage that we are also ready to do between higher education and our community groups. How is that really going to happen? You know, I used to see how Vietnamese students, Vietnamese kids would go to court when the boat people were coming over here, right? The court would say, no, the Vietnamese community cannot be in one place. There was all these people, I forgot now who, went to court to say, oh, please put them all in one place. No, spread them all over the country. And so all these Vietnamese kids were taking cars, driving around the country, getting arrested for drugs and everything, because they couldn't find their family. But the social policy was to break them up, make them all over the place, so maybe that way they won't make trouble. But of course, that's exactly how they make trouble, because you've destroyed their community. And that's the policy of the country. Now, for us to put things together, luckily in Chinatown, maybe we still have a community there, but a lot of people in the community are saying that maybe in 50 years, maybe even less, that community won't be there. It'll turn into like LA's Chinatown. We need to capitalize on what communities we have, and then see how the diversity that's in the mainstream and a lot of Hapas, how they now see their background that they've probably hidden in the rug somewhere. How do they, what does that come out for them? And see how really, like Browning of America, how brown is it? You know, and how can we get them to face that color? What does it mean? Who is America now? Sorry, Republicans, you know, no, that's a dream, that's gone. And we don't tell our community people that, then they don't know. They think we're just talking to funders to get more money. Our community people don't know. We should be talking to them. And I just, you know, I just feel we, you know, okay.
I think this concludes our section of the program for this afternoon, and we have Jan here. I wanted to thank our very generous panel and for your comments and contributions this afternoon. And I don't know, Jan, if you wanted to offer an update on Imagining America.
And I'm sorry I couldn't be here earlier. We had 2 IA Imagining America events in New York today, and I was on the program for the other one till 3, so it's nice to be here for at least part of it. I know Randy met with some people who've been working continuously on the conference. If there are any other questions about proposals people want to make, workshops they want to suggest, seminars, I'd be happy to answer. In terms of update, I can tell you that I've been in touch with Kevin Bott, who some of you met. He's our associate director. We're based at Syracuse University, so that's why Kevin can't be here today. But Monday was when the proposals were due from around the country for the conference, and there were over 100. So there's a lot of enthusiasm about the topic, and that's really good news. And our conferences are always very interactive. The idea of the sessions, that there's always something presented or something kind of instigated by some people, but then the idea, we really try to look at the conference as a way to build knowledge, respond to each other, take something further, not simply present it. So that's good that there's that many, but the idea is that we want a whole kind of spine of New York presentations. This conference is in New York. New York site visits. Half the conference is Friday, Saturday, Sunday, October 5th, 6th, 7th, and all afternoon that Friday we everybody goes out on site visits. All 5 boroughs, we're actually being at the place where work is being created in various communities with cultural organizations, with some higher ed partners, that when it makes sense to actually go to the place for the exchange to happen, that's what we do. So questions about conference, ideas people have, and they kind of wonder, is this in the realm of what an IA conference could accommodate? No questions. Well, all right, that was easy. Well, if you do, if they, you know, it's important to know that now we need to know what the New York people are coming up with by June 1st, during the month of May. So did Randy give out the information for how to submit those proposals? I can send them around to people. Let me send them around then to people who are facilitating the subgroups, so that you can share it with your group, because there is a platform to email it to.
Oh, okay, no, we didn't.
Okay, so I can pull it out, or it might be easier to just get by email. Okay.
So I guess that concludes our program.